Listen well, children, to this tale from the ancient village of Ukechi, where the spirits still whisper warnings to those who dare to listen. In those days, long before your grandparents drew their first breath, Ukechi was known throughout all the lands for one thing above all others: its mighty hunters. The men of Ukechi could track a leopard through the thickest forest and bring down a buffalo with a single spear throw. But among hunters, respect was not given freely. Oh no, it was earned with each successful hunt, measured by the weight of meat carried home on weary shoulders. The village elders would gather children around crackling fires, their weathered faces dancing in the orange light, and speak in hushed, reverent tones of the greatest hunter who ever lived. This legendary man had once brought down an enormous elephant, so massive that its meat fed every soul in Ukechi for 6 full moons. Such stories filled the air like sweet smoke as the season turned and the annual hunting competition drew near. Hearts quickened with excitement, and the very ground seemed to pulse with anticipation. For this year would be different from all others. This year, even the king himself had made a promise that would change everything. The king's messenger had arrived at dawn, his voice booming across the village square like thunder rolling over the hills. The royal drums echoed his words, and every man, woman, and child rushed from their huts to hear the magnificent announcement. "Hear this proclamation from your king," the messenger declared, his colorful robes billowing in the morning breeze. "To the hunter who proves himself the greatest in this year's competition, His Majesty will grant a vast piece of the most fertile land in all the kingdom." The crowd erupted in cheers that could be heard 3 villages away. Fertile land meant wealth beyond imagination. Rich soil that would feed families for generations, crops that would grow tall and strong, and cattle that would multiply like stars in the night sky. Immediately, the village transformed into a buzzing hive of preparation. The rhythmic ring of metal on metal filled the air as hunters sharpened their spears until they gleamed like lightning. Bowstrings were tested and retested, arrows were crafted with the finest care, and hunting strategies were whispered between trusted friends. The excitement was so thick you could almost taste it, sweet and electric on your tongue. But little did anyone know that while honest men prepared with honor, one lazy soul was already plotting a path to victory that would bring shame upon his name forever. The drums of preparation thundered day and night. In every corner of Ukechi, hunters made ready for the greatest competition in living memory. Wives ground herbs for strength potions, children collected the straightest sticks for arrows, and grandmothers offered prayers to the spirits of successful hunts. The village blacksmith's forge glowed red-hot as he hammered out new spear tips, each one sharp enough to pierce an elephant's hide. His hammer sang a song of metal and fire that made every hunter's heart race with anticipation. Young men practiced their aim from dawn to dusk, sending arrows whistling through the air toward targets painted on tree trunks. The forest echoed with their calls and the snap of bowstrings, as they prepared their bodies and minds for the challenge ahead. The older hunters, wise in the ways of the wild, gathered to share secrets passed down from father to son. They spoke of wind patterns that would carry scent, moon phases that would affect animal behavior, and the sacred rituals that would bring good fortune. As the competition day approached, the entire village hummed with energy. Children ran through the streets, pretending to be great hunters, while their mothers prepared feast foods for the celebration that would follow. Even the village dogs seemed to sense the excitement, barking and wagging their tails as if they too understood that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Among all the hunters preparing for glory, 2 men stood out like fire and water, so different were they in every way that mattered. The first was Amadi, beloved by all who knew him, a hunter whose reputation shone as bright as the morning sun. Amadi rose before dawn every day, not from duty but from pure love of the hunt. His muscles were strong from years of carrying heavy game through the forest, and his eyes sharp from countless hours tracking the smallest signs. When Amadi spoke, even the oldest hunters leaned forward to listen, for his words came from wisdom earned through sweat and experience. The children of Ukechi would gather around Amadi whenever he returned from a successful hunt, their eyes wide with wonder as he told tales of his adventures. He never boasted or made his achievements sound greater than they were. Instead, he spoke with quiet pride of respecting the animals he hunted and thanking the gods for their gifts. But there was another hunter in Ukechi, one whose name would soon be remembered for very different reasons. This man was called Obesai, and if Amadi was like the sun, then Obesai was like a dark cloud that blocked its light. Where Amadi worked hard, Obesai preferred to rest in the shade. Where Amadi shared his knowledge freely, Obesai kept his secrets to himself. And most dangerous of all, where Amadi felt gratitude for his blessings, Obesai burned with envy for what others possessed. Obesai's hut sat at the edge of the village, and from his doorway, he could see directly into Amadi's compound. Day after day, he watched as people came to seek Amadi's advice, bringing gifts of palm wine and kola nuts in thanks for past help. This sight filled Obesai's heart with bitter poison. He would sit on his wooden stool, drinking palm wine until his thoughts grew cloudy, and mutter complaints to anyone who would listen. "Look at him," Obesai would grumble, pointing a shaking finger toward Amadi's successful hunts. "See how the gods favor him while honest men like me struggle." But Obesai's words twisted the truth like smoke twists in the wind. For while he spoke of being an honest man who struggled, the real struggle was his own laziness fighting against his desire for easy success. When other hunters rose before sunrise to track game, Obesai would roll over in his sleeping mat and snore until the sun was high overhead. When the hunting competition was announced, Obesai's envy grew so strong it was like a fever burning inside him. He convinced himself that Amadi's success came not from skill and hard work, but from secret charms and magic potions. There must be some trick, he whispered to himself in the darkness of his hut. No man could be so successful without the help of powerful spirits. Perhaps he has made a deal with forces that honest hunters would never touch. The truth, however, was as clear as water from a mountain spring. Amadi's success came from something far more powerful than magic. It came from dedication, respect, and an unshakable belief in doing things the right way. Every morning, Amadi would visit the village shrine before beginning his hunt. He would kneel on the worn stones, place offerings of grain and palm wine before the carved images of the hunting spirits, and speak words of gratitude for past successes and humble requests for guidance. His preparations were thorough and methodical. Amadi would study the weather patterns, check the wind direction, and examine animal tracks with the careful attention of a master craftsman studying his finest work. He knew which paths the antelope favored during the dry season and where the wild boar liked to drink during the heat of midday. Most importantly, Amadi treated every hunt as a sacred contract between himself and the spirits of the forest. He took only what he needed, used every part of the animal he caught, and always returned to the shrine afterward to offer thanks for the gifts he had received. This was the real source of his power, not magic or secret charms, but the simple truth that the gods bless those who approach them with pure hearts and honest effort. Yet Obesai, blinded by his own laziness and envy, could not see this truth even when it blazed before him like the noonday sun. The morning of the competition arrived like a festival day blessed by the gods themselves. The sun rose in a sky so clear and blue it seemed painted by the spirits, and a gentle breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers throughout the village. The great drums began their ceremonial beating while the stars were still fading from the sky. Their deep, resonant voices called every soul in Yukechi to witness the grand departure of their hunters. Men, women, and children poured from their huts, dressed in their finest clothes and carrying good luck charms to bless their favorite competitors. In the village square, the hunters assembled like a gathering of eagles. Their spears caught the early morning light, and their faces showed the calm determination of men ready to prove their worth. Each hunter had painted special symbols on his forehead, marks of protection and power passed down from their ancestors. Amadi stood among them, quiet and focused, his hunting bag carefully packed with everything he might need for 3 days in the forest. His spear was perfectly balanced, his bowstring tested and true, and his eyes already scanning the tree line where his greatest challenge waited. The village chief raised his staff high above his head, and the crowd fell silent. In that moment, every heart beat with the same rhythm, every breath was drawn in anticipation, and every eye focused on the forest that would decide their champion. "Go forth, hunters of Yukechi," the chief's voice boomed across the square. "May your spears fly true, may your feet find the right paths, and may the spirits of the forest look kindly upon your efforts." The crowd erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very leaves from the trees. Women ululated in the traditional cry of encouragement, children waved palm fronds, and the drums beat faster, matching the racing hearts of the hunters as they began their march toward the forest. One by one, the hunters raised their spears in salute to the village, then turned and walked with steady, confident steps toward the green wall of trees that would test everything they had learned. Their families called out blessings, their friends shouted words of encouragement, and their children ran alongside them until they reached the forest's edge. Amati paused at the last moment, turning back to give a respectful nod to the elders before disappearing into the shadows between the trees. His step was sure, his purpose clear, and his heart filled with the quiet confidence that comes from thorough preparation and honest intentions. But as the last hunter vanished into the forest and the crowd began to disperse, one figure remained conspicuously absent from the grand departure. Obasai had not joined the march. Instead, he lay on his sleeping mat, one arm flung over his eyes, pretending the drumbeats were just an annoying interruption to his morning rest. While the true hunters of Yukechi tracked through forest paths and climbed over fallen logs in pursuit of their quarry, Obasai remained in his hut like a lizard sleeping on a warm rock. The sounds of the village drifted through his doorway, children playing hunting games, women preparing the feast that would welcome the competitors home, and elders sharing predictions about who might claim victory. Obasai ignored it all. Instead, he reached for his gourd of palm wine and took a long, careless drink. The bitter liquid matched his bitter thoughts as he convinced himself that his laziness was actually cleverness. Let them exhaust themselves chasing animals through thorns and mud, he muttered to the empty air. A smart man waits for the right opportunity. Why should I break my back when there might be an easier way? Hours passed like this, with Obasai drowsing and drinking while precious hunting time slipped away like water through his fingers. The sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows, and still he made no move toward the forest where glory waited for those brave enough to seek it. By midday, when the other hunters were deep in the wilderness, tracking spoor and reading the subtle signs that would lead them to their prizes, Obasai had accomplished nothing more than emptying his wine gourd and filling his belly with lazy complaints. He had no plan, no strategy, and no intention of doing the hard work that victory required. But fate, as you will see, was already preparing a temptation that would test his character in ways he never imagined. The first day passed, then the second, and still Obasai remained in his compound, watching clouds drift overhead and nursing his grievances like a mother tends a sick child. From time to time, he would hear distant sounds from the forest, a hunter's call echoing between the trees, or the snap of a branch as some great animal moved through the underbrush. Each sound reminded him that while he lounged in comfort, other men were pursuing the glory and rich rewards that could have been his. Yet still he did not move, convinced that somehow opportunity would find him without effort on his part. On the dawn of the third and final day, something finally stirred within Obasai's wine-clouded mind. Perhaps it was the realization that the competition would soon end, or perhaps it was simply that his palm wine had run out and he needed a reason to leave his hut. Whatever the cause, he finally rose from his sleeping mat, picked up his neglected hunting spear, and shuffled toward the forest like a man walking to his own grave. His steps were unsteady, his eyes bloodshot from too much drink and too little sleep, and his hands shook from both nervousness and the effects of his long celebration. As he entered the forest, Obasai moved with none of the careful stealth that marks a true hunter. He crashed through bushes, stumbled over roots, and made enough noise to frighten away any game within a mile of his clumsy passage. The forest, which had welcomed skilled hunters with its abundance of game, seemed to turn its back on Obasai like a disappointed parent. Every path he followed led nowhere. Every promising sound turned out to be only the wind in the leaves or a harmless bird fluttering between branches. His spear, unused for so many months that spiders had built webs between its shaft and point, felt awkward in his unpracticed hands. His eyes, accustomed to the dim light of his hut and the close focus of a wine gourd, struggled to read the subtle signs that would reveal where animals might be hiding. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, Obasai's frustration grew like a fire fed with dry grass. He had entered the forest expecting to find game waiting for him like fruit hanging from a tree, ready to be plucked with minimal effort. Instead, he found only empty trails, disturbed earth where other hunters had already passed, and the mocking calls of birds that seemed to laugh at his clumsy attempts to move quietly through their domain. Finally, as the sun reached its highest point and his stomach began to rumble with hunger, Obesai spotted something moving in the undergrowth ahead. His heart leaped with hope and excitement as he raised his spear, ready to claim his first prize of the competition. But when he crept closer and parted the bushes with trembling hands, his dreams of easy victory crumbled like dried mud in the rain. There, sitting on a low branch and regarding him with bright, curious eyes, was a squirrel so small and scrawny that it would barely make a mouthful for a hungry child. Its ribs showed through its patchy fur, and its tail was missing half its hair from some past misadventure. This pathetic creature was the sum total of Obesai's hunting success after 3 days of competition. While other hunters were bringing down antelope, wild boar, and forest buffalo, he had managed to find only this pitiful excuse for game. The squirrel chattered at him mockingly, as if it too understood the shame of his situation, then bounded away into the trees, leaving Obesai alone with his failure and his rapidly growing panic. The competition would end at sunset. Soon, the hunters would gather in the village square to display their prizes and claim their rewards. The thought of standing before the king and his fellow villagers with empty hands filled Obesai with a terror worse than facing a charging leopard. He began to run through the forest, no longer caring about stealth or proper hunting technique. Branches tore at his clothes and thorns scratched his skin as he crashed through the underbrush in desperate search of any animal, no matter how small or weak. But the forest had already given its gifts to those who deserved them. For Obesai, there was nothing left but the bitter taste of his own laziness and the growing certainty that he would return home in disgrace. As Obesai stumbled through the forest in his panicked search, his feet carried him along a path he had not intended to take. This trail wound away from the hunting grounds and toward the sacred heart of the forest, where the ancient shrine stood in a clearing blessed by generations of worship. The shrine was older than anyone's memory, built of stones carried from the sacred mountain and carved with symbols that held power beyond human understanding. It was here that hunters came to offer thanks for successful expeditions and to seek the blessing of the spirits before undertaking particularly dangerous hunts. Palm fronds created a natural roof over the altar, and the ground around it was swept clean and scattered with flower petals that the village maidens replaced each morning. The air itself seemed different here. Cleaner, more peaceful, and filled with an invisible presence that made even the boldest hunters speak in whispers. As Obesai approached the clearing, his desperation made him forget the reverence that this holy place demanded. He was thinking only of his empty hands and the shame that awaited him when he heard voices coming from the direction of the shrine. Hidden behind the trunk of a massive tree, Obesai peered into the clearing and saw a sight that stopped his breath in his throat. There, kneeling before the altar in prayer, was a Mahdi. And lying on the shrine's sacred stones, offered to the gods in humble gratitude, was the most magnificent antelope Obesai had ever seen. The antelope was a creature that seemed to have stepped from the dreams of the gods themselves. Its coat gleamed like polished bronze in the dappled sunlight, and its magnificent horns curved in perfect spirals that spoke of strength and grace. Even in death, there was something noble about the animal that made it clear this was no ordinary catch. A Mahdi knelt beside his offering, his head bowed in prayer, his voice too quiet for Obesai to hear the words. But the posture itself told the story. Here was a hunter giving thanks for his success and asking for the continued blessing of the spirits who ruled over all life in the forest. This was the way of true hunters, the path that Obesai's ancestors had followed for countless generations. Success was not something to be hoarded or boasted about, but rather a gift to be shared with the gods who made all things possible. But as Obesai watched from his hiding place, his heart filled not with respect or understanding, but with a burning envy so fierce it made his hands shake and his vision blur with rage. Here was the prize that would surely win the competition, the magnificent catch that would earn a Mahdi the king's reward of fertile land and lasting honor. And it was just lying there, unguarded, waiting for someone bold enough to take it. The thought crept into Obesai's mind like poison seeping into a wound, and once there, it grew stronger with each passing moment. After all, he told himself, wasn't he just as deserving of success as any other hunter? Mahdi finished his prayers and rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his knees with the careful movements of a man who had spent long hours in the forest. He took one last look at his offering, nodded with satisfaction, and walked away down the path that would take him back to prepare for the evening's presentation. The moment Mahdi disappeared from sight, Obesai felt his last restraint snap like overstretched rope. The antelope lay there on the sacred stones, its magnificence calling to his desperate hunger for success. His rational mind whispered warnings about the sanctity of the shrine and the terrible consequences of stealing from the gods, but his greed shouted louder than wisdom. "No one is watching," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible even in the sacred silence of the clearing. "The gods are far away, and Amadi will never know what happened to his offering. He can always catch another animal." But even as he spoke these lies to justify his planned crime, a chill ran down his spine like ice water. The very air around the shrine seemed to grow heavier, and the shadows appeared to deepen despite the afternoon sun shining overhead. Unknown to Obeitai, his words were not unheard. The spirits of the forest, the guardians of the shrine, and the gods themselves had witnessed his approach and heard his whispered justifications. Their ancient eyes watched with growing anger as Obeitai stepped into the sacred clearing, his intentions written clearly across his guilt-stained face. With movements quick as a striking snake and just as poisonous, Obeitai grabbed the magnificent antelope and hoisted it onto his shoulders. The animal's weight was tremendous, its body still warm from recent life, and its blood stained Obeisai's clothes as he struggled to carry his stolen prize. His guilty conscience made every shadow seem like an accusing eye, every rustling leaf sound like voices whispering of his crime. He stumbled and staggered through the forest, following paths he hoped no other hunter would take, desperate to reach his compound without being seen. By the time he reached his hut, Obeitai was gasping for breath and drenched in sweat. He dumped the antelope behind his house and quickly covered it with palm fronds, then stood back to admire what he had accomplished. For a moment, the sight of the magnificent animal filled him with triumphant joy. Here was his ticket to victory, his path to the king's reward, his answer to all the years of watching Amadi's success with bitter envy. But as the excitement faded, a strange uneasiness began to creep over him like fog rolling in from the river. The air around his compound felt different somehow, colder, despite the warm afternoon sun, and filled with an oppressive silence that made his skin crawl. The gods had not forgotten his crime, though Obeitai tried to convince himself that his theft had gone unnoticed. Forces older than the village itself were already stirring, preparing to deliver a justice that would echo through generations. The final day of the competition dawned with all the ceremony and excitement the people of Ukechi had anticipated. But as the sun rose higher, something began to feel wrong about the morning in ways that even children could sense. Usually, the festival day arrived with crystal-clear skies and gentle breezes that carried the sweet scent of flowers and the promising aroma of feast foods cooking over fires. But this morning, despite the bright sunshine, there was a heaviness in the air that made everyone feel slightly uneasy. The village square had been decorated with colorful banners and fresh palm fronds. Drums stood ready to announce each hunter's presentation, and the carved wooden seat where the king would judge the competition had been polished until it gleamed like gold. Women wore their finest clothes and most precious jewelry, while children ran through the crowd with painted faces and toy spears, acting out their own versions of great hunting adventures. The aroma of roasted meat and spiced vegetables filled the air, making everyone's mouth water in anticipation of the victory feast. Yet despite all this preparation and excitement, sensitive souls throughout the village felt an invisible tension, like the pressure that builds in the air before a great storm. Elder women whispered to each other about strange dreams they had shared, and dogs began to whine and pace restlessly for reasons their owners could not understand. Something momentous was approaching Ukechi, something that would change the village forever. As the morning progressed, the signs of divine displeasure became impossible to ignore. Clouds began to gather on the horizon, dark and heavy despite the weatherseer's predictions of a perfect day. The wind, which should have been gentle and warm, began to blow in fitful gusts that rattled the decorations and made the banners snap like angry voices. The king arrived in his royal litter, carried by 8 strong men and surrounded by his colorful entourage of drummers, praise singers, and royal guards. The crowd cheered as custom demanded, but their voices seemed muted, as if the very air was absorbing the sound and giving nothing back. One by one, the hunters began to return from the forest, their faces glowing with pride and their shoulders bent under the weight of their successful catches. Each man's family rushed forward to greet him with songs of celebration, and the village square began to fill with the evidence of their skill. Wild boar with curved tusks gleaming, forest antelope with coats like burnished copper, and even a young buffalo that had required 3 men to carry, all laid out on woven mats for the king's inspection. The sight of so much success should have filled every heart with joy and pride. But Obeitai, standing at the edge of the crowd with his stolen prize hidden beneath palm fronds, felt only a growing terror as he watched the other hunters present their honest catches to the approval of the king and the celebration of their families. Then, just as the king rose to begin his formal judging of the competition, the sky opened and released a torrent of rain unlike anything the people of Yukechi had ever experienced on a festival day. The water fell in sheets so thick it was impossible to see from one side of the square to the other. This was not the gentle, blessing rain that the gods sent to water crops and fill the rivers. This was the kind of rain that spoke of divine anger, cold and harsh and driven by winds that seemed to howl with supernatural fury. The villagers scattered, seeking shelter under any available roof, while the king's servants rushed to protect their royal master with hastily raised canopies. The carefully prepared feast was ruined in moments, and the decorated square became a muddy battlefield where people slipped and struggled to find their footing. But even more disturbing than the unexpected storm was what happened to the carefully arranged hunting trophies. The rain seemed to single them out with particular fury, washing away the bright decorations and turning the display into a soggy, unrecognizable mess. In the chaos and confusion, as people ran for shelter and tried to salvage what they could of the ruined celebration, a figure appeared at the edge of the square that made everyone's blood freeze in their veins. The village oracle, his white hair streaming in the wind and his ancient eyes blazing with divine fire, strode through the storm as if the rain and wind dared not touch him. The oracle was a man so old that no one could remember his real name. He had served as the voice of the gods for longer than most people had been alive, and when he spoke, even the king himself listened with respectful attention. His presence at the festival was not unusual. The oracle often attended important village ceremonies to offer blessings and guidance. But his manner today was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. His usually calm face was twisted with fury, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a power that made the very ground seem to tremble beneath everyone's feet. "People of Yukechi," he roared, his words somehow audible above the storm's fury. "The gods are angry. Someone among you has committed a crime so terrible that the spirits themselves weep with rage." A terrified silence fell over the crowd, broken only by the drumming of rain on rooftops and the occasional crack of thunder overhead. Even small children stopped crying and stared at the oracle with wide, frightened eyes. The old man raised his staff, carved with symbols of power and authority, and pointed it toward the sky where lightning flickered between the clouds. "The sacred shrine has been violated. An offering meant for the gods has been stolen by greedy hands." Gasps of horror rippled through the crowd like wind through grain. To steal from the gods was the most terrible crime imaginable, a sin that would bring curse and disaster not just upon the thief, but upon the entire community that harbored him. "I call upon the guilty one to confess," the oracle's voice boomed across the square, seeming to echo from the very stones beneath their feet. "Step forward now and face the judgment you have earned, or the gods will strike you down where you stand." Every eye in the crowd began to dart nervously from face to face, searching for some sign of guilt, some indication of who might have committed such an unthinkable crime. Mothers pulled their children closer, fathers stood straighter to show their innocence, and the hunters who had worked honestly for their success looked both confused and outraged. But one man in the crowd was not looking around in confusion or righteous anger. Obeitai stood frozen at the edge of the square, his face as white as limestone and his whole body shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. The stolen antelope, hidden beneath palm fronds in his compound, seemed to burn in his memory like a brand pressed against his soul. Every word the oracle spoke felt like a spear thrust directly at his guilty heart, and he could feel the eyes of the gods themselves boring into his very spirit. His legs felt like water, his mouth was dry as dust, and his heart hammered against his ribs so hard he was certain everyone around him could hear it. The weight of his crime, which he had tried so desperately to ignore, now pressed down upon him like a mountain of stone. The oracle's blazing eyes swept across the crowd, and Obeitai was certain they lingered on him for a moment longer than on anyone else. "The gods see all," the oracle continued, his voice rising even higher above the storm's fury. "They know which hands have touched what was not meant for mortal use. They know which heart harbors the poison of theft and greed. Thunder crashed overhead as if the sky itself was expressing divine anger, and lightning illuminated the scene in stark, terrible clarity. The rain continued to fall in torrents, but the oracle stood untouched by the storm, as if protected by invisible shields of righteousness. Obasai felt his resolve crumbling like mud walls in floodwater. The guilt that he had tried to bury beneath justifications and excuses now rose up to choke him like rising floodwaters. He could not breathe, could not think, could not do anything but feel the terrible weight of his crime pressing down upon his soul. Around him, the crowd waited in terrified silence for someone to step forward and confess. The tension was so thick it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on everyone like the oppressive air before an earthquake. Finally, unable to bear the pressure any longer, Obasai stumbled forward through the crowd, his legs barely able to carry him. People stepped aside as he passed, their faces showing confusion and growing understanding as they realized who was approaching the oracle's judgment seat. His voice cracked like a boy's changing voice, barely audible above the storm. I took it. I stole the antelope from the shrine. The confession hit the crowd like a physical blow, causing gasps of shock and horror to ripple through the assembled villagers. Some people stepped back from Obasai as if his crime might be contagious, while others stared at him with the fascinated revulsion usually reserved for dangerous snakes or deadly spiders. The king himself rose from his carved seat, his royal face showing the kind of anger that could topple kingdoms and destroy entire bloodlines. To think that such a crime had been committed in his presence, at a competition he had personally sponsored, was an insult that demanded the severest punishment. But it was Amadi's reaction that cut deepest into Obasai's guilty heart. The honest hunter stood among his peers, his face showing not anger but a deep, profound sadness. This was a man who had worked hard for his success, who had followed all the proper customs and shown proper respect to the gods, only to have his sacred offering stolen by someone he had considered a neighbor and fellow hunter. The oracle's blazing eyes fixed upon Obasai with the intensity of the sun focused through a crystal. You have not only stolen from a fellow human, the old man declared, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm, you have robbed the gods themselves of what was rightfully theirs. You have brought shame not only upon your own name, but upon the entire village that sheltered and fed you. Your greed has poisoned the very air we breathe and called down divine wrath upon innocent people. Obasai fell to his knees in the mud, his stolen victory turning to ashes in his mouth as he realized the true magnitude of what he had done. The punishment, when it came, was swift and final. The king's voice rang out across the square with the authority of absolute judgment. Let this man be banished from Ukechi forever. Let his name be forgotten, his family line dishonored, and his very existence erased from our memory. Royal guards stepped forward to ensure the sentence was carried out immediately. Obasai was stripped of his hunter's weapons, his village membership tokens, and even the clothes that marked him as a son of Ukechi. Wrapped in nothing but a rough cloth, he was driven from the square like a diseased animal, while the crowd watched in stunned silence. As the rain began to lighten and the storm clouds started to break apart, revealing patches of clear sky, the village oracle turned to address Amadi. The honest hunter stepped forward, his head bowed with respect and his heart still heavy with sadness at his neighbor's fall. Your offering was pure and your intentions were honest, the oracle declared, his voice now gentler than before. The gods have seen your righteousness and will bless your victory with abundance. And indeed, as the storm cleared completely and the sun emerged to shine upon the festival once more, it became clear that Amadi had not only won the competition but had earned something far more valuable, the complete trust and respect of both his community and the gods themselves. The king proclaimed him the winner and granted him the promised fertile land, but everyone understood that the real victory was the preservation of honor and honesty in their village. From that day forward, the story of Obasai's greed and downfall became a tale told around every fire in Ukechi, passed down from grandparents to grandchildren as a warning about the terrible price of dishonesty and theft. The elders would gather the young people close when the moon was full and the night was quiet, and they would speak in solemn voices about the hunter who thought he could cheat the gods themselves. They would describe his empty hands and desperate heart, his moment of terrible temptation, and the swift justice that followed his crime. But they always ended the story with the same proverb, one that was born from Obasai's folly and carved into the heart of village wisdom: greed eats the hunter before hunger does. These words became a guiding light for future generations, reminding them that true success comes only through honest effort, respect for the divine, and consideration for one's fellow human beings. The fertile land that Amadi received flourished under his care, and his children grew up to become honorable hunters who followed their father's example of hard work and integrity. As for Obesai, he disappeared into the great forest and was never seen again. Some say he died alone and forgotten, consumed by the very greed that had driven him to his crime. Others whisper that he wanders still between the trees, a living reminder of what happens when desire overpowers wisdom. But his true legacy lives on in the proverb that bears his shame, ensuring that his story will continue to protect future generations from the poison of envy and greed that destroyed him.